Close your eyes for a moment and think about the last time you told yourself, "I'm just not motivated." What if that wasn't a flaw in who you are, but a signal from your brain waiting to be trained? We've been taught that motivation is something you either have or you don't, a gift, a personality trait. A lucky break, but the brain doesn't work that way. Motivation is built quietly through repeated actions, through where you place your attention, and through how you respond when things get hard. Tonight, I want to show you that motivation isn't missing from you, it's waiting for you to build it. For years, many of us have believed that motivation is something you are born with. Some people seem driven, disciplined, and energetic, while others feel stuck, inconsistent, or easily distracted. This belief quietly shapes how we judge ourselves. When motivation fades, we don't question our habits. We question our identity. We say things like, "I'm just not a motivated person," and we treat that statement as a fixed truth. But neuroscience tells a very different story. Motivation is not a permanent feature of personality. It is a temporary and trainable state of the brain. Like focus, mood, or alertness, motivation fluctuates based on how neural circuits are activated, strengthened, or weakened over time. The brain is constantly changing in response to experience, a property known as neuroplasticity. This means that motivation is shaped by what you repeatedly do, what you pay attention to, and how you interpret effort and challenge. At a biological level, motivation is closely tied to specific brain networks involving dopamine. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the pleasure chemical, but its real role is to signal anticipation and pursuit. It helps the brain decide what is worth effort. When dopamine circuits are activated in a healthy way, you feel a sense of drive, not because something is easy or enjoyable, but because it feels meaningful to move forward. When these circuits are underused or misdirected, motivation feels low, even if the goal matters deeply. This is why waiting to feel motivated rarely works. Motivation does not magically appear before action. Instead, it is generated by action, when you engage in effort, especially effort that feels challenging but purposeful. The brain begins to associate that behavior with progress. Over time, this strengthens the neural pathways responsible for motivation. In other words, motivation is often the result of doing the work, not the prerequisite for it. Another key factor is attention. The brain allocates motivation toward whatever you repeatedly focus on. If your attention is constantly pulled toward comfort, distraction, or instant rewards, the brain learns that effort is unnecessary. But when attention is trained toward goals that require patience and persistence, the brain adapts. It starts to allocate energy and drive toward those outcomes. Motivation follows attention. Understanding motivation as a brain state is powerful because it removes shame. If motivation were a personality trait, then low motivation would mean something is wrong with you. But if motivation is a state, then it can be changed. It can be trained, strengthened, and rebuilt. Just like a muscle. Temporary lack of motivation is not a verdict on your character. It is feedback from your nervous system. This shift in perspective changes everything. Instead of asking, "Why am I not motivated?" you begin asking, "What behaviors, inputs, and challenges am I reinforcing in my brain?" That question puts control back in your hands. Motivation becomes something you practice, not something you wait for. When you understand that motivation lives in the brain, and that the brain changes through repeated action, you stop identifying as unmotivated. You start identifying as someone in training. And that single reframing can be the first step toward building a level of drive you once believed you simply didn't have. Most people wait for motivation to show up before they take action. They tell themselves, "Once I feel motivated, I'll start," but the brain doesn't operate in that order. From a neuroscience perspective, motivation is not the spark that starts movement, it is the byproduct of movement itself. Action comes first, motivation follows. When you take action, especially when it feels difficult or inconvenient, you send a powerful signal to your brain. That signal is simple. This behavior matters. The brain responds by allocating energy, focus, and neurochemical support to that activity. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. Action strengthens motivation, and motivation then makes future action easier. But without the first step, the loop never begins. This is why waiting for motivation often leads to paralysis. The brain is efficient. If it senses that no action is required, it conserves energy. Motivation drops not because you are lazy, but because your nervous system has learned that effort is optional. The moment you initiate action, no matter how small, you interrupt that pattern. Even a brief effort can shift the brain from a passive state into a state of engagement. At the neurochemical level, effort triggers dopamine release after progress is made, not before. Dopamine reinforces behaviors that move you closer to a goal. This means the brain rewards doing, not thinking about doing. Planning, visualizing, or waiting for the right mood may feel productive, but they don't activate the same neural pathways as real effort. Only action tells the brain that something is worth pursuing. Small actions are especially powerful because they lower the threshold for engagement. The brain is more willing to invest energy when the perceived cost is low. This is why starting with a short walk, a single page, or 5 minutes of focused work can dramatically change your mental state. Once movement begins, momentum builds. Motivation grows in proportion to consistency, not intensity. Another critical point is that discomfort is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that the brain is learning. When you act in spite of resistance, you teach your nervous system that effort is survivable. Over time, the brain recalibrates its response to challenge. Tasks that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. Motivation increases not because the work got easier, but because your tolerance for effort expanded. This principle also explains why discipline often outperforms inspiration. Discipline is simply the practice of taking action without waiting for motivation. Each time you act despite low drive, you reinforce neural circuits associated with self-directed behavior. The brain starts to predict that action will occur regardless of mood. As a result, it prepares motivation in advance. Understanding that action precedes motivation is liberating. It removes the pressure to feel ready. You don't need confidence, clarity, or excitement to begin. You need movement. Motivation will meet you on the other side of effort. When you stop asking, "Do I feel motivated?" and start asking, "What is the smallest action I can take right now?" you shift from passivity to control. That shift is not psychological, it is biological, and over time, it trains the brain to generate motivation on demand, not by chance. Your brain is constantly deciding what deserves energy. It does this not through willpower, but through attention. Whatever you repeatedly focus on, your brain begins to treat as important. Over time, attention shapes motivation, behavior, and even identity. This is why two people can face the same challenge and respond in completely different ways because their attention is trained differently. From a neural perspective, attention acts like a spotlight. When you focus on something, the brain increases activity in the circuits associated with it. Those circuits become more efficient, more responsive, and more likely to activate in the future. In simple terms, attention tells the brain this matters. Motivation follows that signal. If your attention is consistently pulled toward comfort, distraction, or immediate reward, the brain adapts. It learns to prioritize ease over effort. Short-term pleasures begin to feel more compelling than long-term goals. Over time, challenging tasks start to feel unusually heavy, not because they are objectively harder, but because the brain has learned to avoid them. Motivation fades where attention no longer goes. The opposite is also true. When attention is repeatedly directed toward effort, learning, and progress, the brain begins to associate these states with value. This does not mean forcing positive thoughts or ignoring discomfort. It means consciously choosing where to place your focus during effort. Are you attending to how hard the task feels or to the fact that you are improving? Are you focused on resistance or on the act of showing up? Attention also determines how the brain interprets challenge. When attention is locked onto threat, failure, or self-judgment, the nervous system shifts into a protective state. Motivation drops as the brain prioritizes safety, but when attention is trained on process, on steps, breath, posture, repetition, the brain remains engaged. It stays in a learning mode rather than a defensive one. Modern environments make this especially difficult. Constant notifications, endless content, and instant feedback train attention toward novelty and reward. The brain becomes accustomed to frequent dopamine spikes without effort. As a result, sustained attention feels uncomfortable. Motivation for deep work declines not because the brain is broken, but because it has been trained for fragmentation. The good news is that attention is trainable. Each time you deliberately return your focus to a task, especially when it would be easier to disengage, you strengthen the neural networks that support motivation. Even brief periods of focused attention can shift the brain's priorities. Over time, the brain learns to allocate drive toward whatever consistently receives your focus. This is why rituals and environments matter. Where you place your phone, how you begin a task, and what you focus on in the first few minutes all influence attention. Those early moments set the tone for the brain's motivational state. Attention, once captured, tends to sustain itself. Ultimately, motivation is not about forcing desire. It is about training attention. The brain does not chase what you say is important. It chases what you consistently focus on. When attention is aligned with effort and purpose, motivation becomes less fragile and more reliable. By learning to guide your attention, especially during discomfort, you teach the brain what to pursue. And over time, that quiet, repeated training reshapes what you feel motivated to do. Most people interpret discomfort as a warning. When something feels hard, awkward, or mentally draining, the instinct is to pull back. The brain whispers, stop, avoid, wait. Over time, this association becomes automatic. Discomfort equals danger, but from a neuroscience perspective, discomfort is often not a signal of harm, it is a signal of change. It means the brain is being asked to operate outside its familiar patterns. The brain is designed to conserve energy and predict outcomes. Familiar behaviors require less effort, so they feel comfortable. New behaviors require more neural resources, which the brain experiences as resistance. This resistance shows up as mental friction, self-doubt, or physical unease, but none of these sensations mean you are doing something wrong. They mean you are learning. When you treat discomfort as a stop sign, the brain learns that avoidance is the correct response. Each time you escape effort, the brain reinforces circuits linked to safety and short-term relief. This reduces your tolerance for challenge and makes future discomfort feel even more intense. Motivation declines not because you lack discipline, but because your brain has been trained to retreat at the first sign of strain. However, when you stay with discomfort without panic or self-judgment, you send a different signal. You tell the brain, this is safe enough. That message allows the nervous system to remain engaged instead of shutting down. Over time, the brain recalibrates. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. This is how resilience is built at a neural level. Discomfort also plays a critical role in shaping motivation. Effort paired with discomfort strengthens dopamine circuits differently than effortless reward. When the brain learns that progress follows challenge, it begins to associate effort with meaning rather than threat. This shift is subtle but powerful. Motivation becomes tied to growth, not ease. It's important to distinguish between harmful stress and productive discomfort. Harmful stress overwhelms the system and leads to burnout. Productive discomfort is challenging but controlled. It stretches capacity without breaking it. The key is not to eliminate discomfort, but to dose it wisely. Short, repeated exposures to challenge teach the brain that effort is survivable and even rewarding. Your response to discomfort matters more than the discomfort itself. If attention goes to self-criticism, I'm not good at this proves I can't do it, the brain interprets the situation as a threat. Motivation drops, but if attention goes to the process, breathing, posture, next step, the brain stays regulated. It remains in learning mode. This is why reframing discomfort changes behavior. Instead of asking, "How do I make this easier?" ask, "How do I stay present while this feels hard?" That single shift keeps the brain engaged. Over time, discomfort loses its power to stop you. Growth does not happen in comfort zones. It happens at the edge of them. Each time you choose to continue despite discomfort, you expand that edge. The brain adapts. Motivation strengthens because the nervous system learns that challenge is not something to fear. It is something to move through. When you stop treating discomfort as a warning and start treating it as information, you unlock a new relationship with effort. Discomfort becomes a compass, not a barrier. And in that space, real, lasting motivation is built. The brain learns through repetition. Not through intensity, not through sudden bursts of inspiration, but through small actions repeated consistently over time. Every behavior you repeat leaves a physical trace in the brain. Neurons that activate together begin to wire together, forming circuits that become easier to access with each repetition. This is how motivation stops being fragile and starts becoming automatic. When an action is new, it requires effort. The brain must recruit multiple regions to coordinate behavior, focus attention, and regulate discomfort. This feels hard and motivation feels low, but with repetition, those neural pathways become more efficient. The brain spends less energy initiating the behavior. What once felt like resistance begins to feel routine. This is not a psychological trick. It is a biological adaptation. Repetition also changes how the brain anticipates effort. Early on, the brain predicts high cost and low reward. That prediction suppresses motivation, but as a behavior is repeated, the prediction shifts. The brain learns that the action is survivable, useful, and often rewarding. Dopamine release becomes more tightly linked to the behavior itself, not just the outcome. Motivation rises because the brain expects progress. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. One extreme effort does little to reshape neural circuits, but modest effort, repeated daily, sends a clear signal to the brain, this matters. Over time, the brain prioritizes that behavior. Motivation no longer depends on mood or willpower. It becomes a default state. Repetition also builds identity at a neural level. The brain uses past behavior to predict future behavior. When you repeatedly act in a certain way, the brain begins to treat that pattern as part of who you are. This reduces internal conflict. You no longer debate whether to act. You simply act. Motivation feels stable because the brain expects follow-through. Importantly, repetition must be paired with attention. Mindless repetition has limited effect. But when attention is present, even briefly, the brain strengthens the relevant circuits more effectively. This means showing up consistently matters more than being perfect. A focused 5 minutes, repeated daily, is more powerful than an unfocused hour once a week. Repetition also reshapes your relationship with failure. When behaviors are repeated regularly, individual setbacks lose their emotional weight. The brain sees them as part of the pattern, not as threats. Motivation stays intact because progress is measured over time, not moment to moment. This is how habits become self-sustaining. What begins as conscious effort slowly becomes automatic. The brain offloads the behavior to more efficient systems, freeing mental energy. Motivation is no longer something you summon. It is something the brain provides because the circuit is already built. Understanding this removes the pressure to feel inspired. You don't need perfect days, you need repeated days. Each repetition, no matter how small, strengthens the circuit. Each skipped repetition weakens it slightly. Over time, these effects compound. When you commit to repetition, you are not relying on motivation. You are building it. You are teaching the brain what to do, when to do it, and how to sustain effort. And once those circuits are wired, motivation becomes less about how you feel and more about who you have trained your brain to be. Every challenge you face leaves a trace in your nervous system. Not because of the outcome, but because of how you respond in the moment. The brain is constantly learning from experience, updating its predictions about what effort, stress, and difficulty mean. Over time, these predictions determine whether motivation rises or collapses when you encounter challenge again. When a challenge appears, the brain makes a rapid assessment. Is this safe? Is this worth the energy? If past experiences taught the brain that challenge leads to overwhelm, failure, or self-criticism, motivation will drop instantly. The nervous system shifts into protection mode. Avoidance feels logical, but if past experiences taught the brain that challenge can be endured, even when uncomfortable motivation stays online, this means your reaction to challenge is more important than success or failure. If you respond with panic, harsh self-talk, or immediate withdrawal, the brain records that pattern. It learns that challenge equals threat. Future challenges then feel heavier before you even begin. Motivation decreases not because of ability, but because of expectation. On the other hand, when you respond to challenge with curiosity, steadiness, or persistence, even briefly, you teach the brain a different lesson. You show it that difficulty is manageable. This keeps the prefrontal cortex engaged, allowing for problem-solving rather than shutdown. Over time, the brain becomes more willing to allocate motivation toward effort. Physiological regulation plays a critical role here. How you breathe, hold tension, and direct attention during challenge influences how the brain encodes the experience. Slow, controlled breathing and a steady posture signal safety to the nervous system. This allows dopamine and focus-related circuits to remain active. Motivation does not disappear because the brain does not feel under threat. Challenge also reshapes motivation through meaning. When effort is linked to purpose rather than ego, the brain responds differently. If failure is interpreted as information instead of identity, the nervous system stays open. Motivation remains intact because the brain is focused on learning, not self-protection. Repeated exposure to challenge, paired with adaptive responses, builds what can be called neural confidence. This is not optimism or positive thinking. It is the brain's learned expectation that you can handle difficulty. That expectation alone increases motivation before action begins. The brain prepares energy because it predicts competence. Importantly, this process does not require dramatic victories. Small, repeated moments of staying engaged during challenge are enough. Each time you resist the urge to quit immediately, you reshape future drive. The brain remembers endurance more than outcomes. Over time, this changes your baseline response to difficulty. Instead of tension and avoidance, you experience alertness and engagement. Motivation becomes a stable resource because the nervous system trusts your ability to respond. Challenge, then, is not something that drains motivation. Poor responses to challenge do. When you learn to meet difficulty with regulation, attention, and persistence, you teach the brain a powerful lesson: effort is safe and progress is possible. That lesson becomes encoded in your nervous system, and once it is, motivation no longer disappears when things get hard. It rises to meet the challenge.